The first memory is a sound, iron striking iron in a vault beneath Terra, a patient rhythm older than any name I know. It rings through stone like a pulse. Dust falls. Candles gutter. On a lectern of adamantine sits a data slate bound in flayed vellum. Its charge long failed, its runes dead, until my touch wakes a ghost of amber across its face. The letters crawl there in a scribe's wounded hand, dated in the years when the Emperor still walked and the Unification Wars had not yet learned the taste of stars. They speak of campaigns that were never spoken of again, of compliance waged against peoples never entered in the rolls, of worlds burning quietly so that history could be louder elsewhere. They are careful with names. They are ruthless with truth, and as I read, the vault seems to tilt. The air grows thin. I hear prayers in the hum of the conduits and feel the weight of 1,000 oaths pressing from the grave. Some wars went missing because they were small, some because they were merciful, some because they were too final to survive the telling. I do not know which I'm holding. I only know that the ink has not finished drying, though 10,000 years have passed. If this chronicle finds you across the roar of the millennia, lend me the quiet of your attention. Share this remembrance if you must, pass it along like contraband fire from shrine to hab to trench. Subscribe your name to the margin as another witness, not for me, but so that our dead do not have to shout to be heard. The Imperium devours memory as surely as it devours worlds. We will not let it finish the meal. The ash had weight to it, a damp heaviness that clung to the tongue the way old prayers cling to the back of the mind. I tasted promethium in every breath and copper in every swallow, as if the city itself were bleeding into my mouth. We moved single file along a corridor whose ceiling had collapsed into a slope of char and twisted rebar, the kind of ruin that turns a step into a gamble and a stumble into a burial. The Vox grill on my collar hissed with a squad channel set too low for comfort, a whisper of numbers and oaths, while the lumen on my wrist sketched thin bones of light across walls once painted administratum green. In my free hand I cradled my lens slate, its cracked viewing pane spidered with old impact, its spirit temperamental but loyal. I had been called many names in my life, remembrancer by those who needed one, parasite by those who didn't, but the file tag on my auspex still used the title the Munitorum Preferred, attached cultural asset, provisional. I answered to it the way a dog answers to a boot, by choosing the angle that hurts least. Sergeant Holt of the 87th Harrogate line led us with the casual cruelty of experience. He had the kind of face war loves to carve, long and spare, lips chewed to bloodless lines by too many winters on too many worlds. Behind him came the engine seer attached to the recovery detail, Lex Mechanic Damaris Quell, a column of red robes and whispering cog-ales, her Vox Halo clicking wasteland Benharic as she soothed the machine spirits we asked to bear our weight. 5 guardsmen padded after, soft-footed despite their carapace plates, lays guns held with the reverence of starving men cradling bread. I walked last because I always do. It is the price of watching. You must let others go first into the dark so that you have a frame to place around their going. The Administratum Annex had burned from the inside out. You can tell by the way the soot pleats on the stone like a skirt caught by an updraft, by the puckering of the iron around window mouths, by the way heat fuses paper to paper until doctrine becomes brick. The air had that sweet sour taint of damp ash long after the fire dies, when the world decides to rot what it cannot finish devouring. We had come for bodies, there are always lists to complete, always tags to reconcile, but Holt carried a second order folded into oilcloth and sealed with wax the color of old wine. He had not told me what it said. He did not need to. My trade is the reading of things men do not say. We found the door by smell first because fire speaks a dialect older than text. Beneath the riot of char and mildew, there was a thread of something clean and sharp like resin or old incense. Holt stopped and tilted his head the way soldiers do when listening to gods they do not trust. Quell's mechadendrites unfolded and tasted the air with auspex petals. Sub-level vestry, she whispered, and the Vox carried the little tremor beneath the machine calm. Heat shielded, locked from within. The wards are ritual, not mechanical. Open it, Holt said, and the way he said it made me look down at his boots instead of his eyes. There are orders that are invitations to sin, and men like Holt have learned to pronounce them as if they were nothing more than weather. Quell's hands, flesh and metal both, came alive with runes of permission as she bent to the lock. I let the lens slate spirit out to play and watched it skim pale gold along the arch. The door had been painted once with an aquila so early in the Imperial style that it made my stomach tighten to see it. The wings too narrow, the heads too hawk-like, the curve of the breastbone more avian than divine. Under the soot you could see a second mark, scratched with a tool too fine for a soldier and too desperate for a scribe. An inverted triangle threaded by a line. It meant nothing to me then. It means too much now. The door protested like a martyr, groaning through bolts that had not moved in a century. When it opened, it did so with suspicion, releasing a breath of air cold enough to scald. Lumen worms coiled along the ceiling flickered once in reflex and died again. The first light in was Holt's muzzle flash as he fired a test bolt into the floor and listened for answering fire. None came. We went in. The vestry had the geometry of a confession, long and narrow, a nave stripped of everything but its bones. Shelves sagged along the walls, their contents reduced to a uniformity of black that made titles pointless. The floor was a continent of paper turned to slag cotton, crisp undertow and treacherous underheel. In the center rose a lectern of adamantine with a spine like a knuckle, the kind of thing men build when they want to persuade themselves that eternity can be hammered into shape. There was a data slate upon it. It had been bound in vellum and stitched with thread the color of oxblood, and where the fire had reached it, the vellum had bubbled into scabs that looked too much like skin. Quell made a sound then, involuntary and low, and I realized with a small and ugly joy that even the Mechanicus can be moved by the sight of a book that has survived a world's dying. She approached with both hands open, palms outward, the ritual of non-coercion, and chanted a blessing that named each hinge, each plate, each rune-etched stud. Holt waited with a twitch in his cheek that meant impatience trying to wear the face of discipline. The guardsman stood at half guard and pretended not to stare at the lectern as if it were the last table in a town without bread. "Machine spirits dormant," Quell said. "Residual charge at," she hesitated, "at levels inconsistent with environmental loss." A mechadendrite's tip grazed the edge of the slate. "I taste preservation." "Open it," Holt said again, softer, and I knew then what was wrapped in his oilcloth. It was not a second order. It was permission to break one. I took the slate because my trade is the theft of breath from the dead. My fingers were numb from cold and ash and fear, but the skin remembered its old litany, the way to hold something that might be the last of its kind. The vellum's texture was all wrong, foxed and puckered but solid, stubborn the way flesh is when it has fought rot and won. I pressed the activation stud and waited for the little refusal every dead thing gives before it yields. But the runes came at once. They rose from within like a breath underwater finding its way to air, a pulse of amber that threw long shadows of our faces across the walls. Quell hissed in Binharik. Holt said a curse so old it had been father to a prayer, I read. The hand was unlike any I'd seen in 1,000 vaults. Scribes learn to know one another by the way ink wastes us, by the tilt of letters and the patience of margins. This hand had been taught by a man who believed you could punch truth onto a page, straight strokes and hard corners, a discipline of geometry rather than grace. The date stamps were wrong on the face of them, written in a system that did not belong to this world and should not have belonged to any world at all. Not regnal or regimental, not stellar or seasonal. The first line said custody transferred by warrant of the Palatine Conclave, signature verified on Terra. The second line said, for eyes sworn to ash ash. The word settled in my mouth like a shard. There are moments when a city is silent in a new way, not because there is no sound, but because the sounds all agree not to contradict one another. The vestry found that silence then. Holt's breathing slowed, Quell's servoskulls stilled in their buzzing, hovering like curious flies around a wound that had yet to admit itself. The guardsmen became statues inhabited by caution. I scrolled the slate with my thumb, careful, hungry. It was not a narrative at first. It was the way all honest wars begin in the record. Lists. Detachments annotated in the shorthands of a dozen departments that refused to acknowledge one another's existence. Supplies weighed as if bread and bolts were commensurate. Names stripped to initials to deny them to grief. Beneath the ledgers, a set of after-action fragments under a sigil that made Quell draw breath between her teeth. 2 heads on one bird, yes, but not the aquila the Imperium wears now. This was a hawk still learning how to be a god. Provenance? Holt asked. Quell shook her head once, sharp enough to suggest pain. The stamp pattern is archaic beyond sanction. The verification cipher reads as primary, she She swallowed. Baseline Terra, meaning someone with the authority to be believed wanted this buried so that belief would not be required. I felt the itch at the base of my skull that comes when a story breaks its own bones to grow larger. I skimmed a fragment chosen at random. The words took a tone in my head because every true account has a voice whether it deserves one or not. Compliance recorded as conferred by silence. Engagement limited to structures marked in diagram set B. Human casualties. Uncounted per the conclave's instruction that uncounting be the form of mercy available to this theater. Observers noted, identifiers withheld. Witness oath appended under seal. I did not mean to say it aloud. Sometimes the mouth betrays the mind to make the world real. Witness oath appended under seal, I whispered, and the vestry air came colder still as if the city resented the theft of its secrecy. Holt stepped closer. His hand hovered over the slate as if he meant to take it and then thought better. What else? He asked. What they killed, I said, and turned the slate to show him the first pic capture embedded in the text. The lens had been cheap for its time, the angle a little off, the focus failing at the edges as if the machine spirit were afraid to see too much. It showed a street half devoured by fire and a door ringed with sigils soot had not yet had time to claim. It showed a figure in bronze plates over bare arms, a helm whose brow ridge was all wrong for anything that had known a chapter's colors. It showed a shadow behind the figure that was not a man at all and yet carried the suggestion of height in the way an upright thought might. The guard's youngest, Trooper Sen, I had learned his name in the way everyone learns in war, by imagining how it will sound when shouted, made a sound that he tried to bury in his sleeve. Saints, he said. Then lower, because shame belongs to the living, I don't know which ones. Quell's voice came clipped and thin. Proto-Astartes, she said, and the term sat in the air like a blasphemy whispered in a shared bed. Armor pattern consistent with pre-legionary trials. No heraldry. No origin glyphs. No, she stopped. No name. Holt looked at me and there was a plea in it too small to be called that without insulting him. How much do you need? He asked, and what he meant was, how much time? He had his own arithmetic. Minutes into casualties. Breaths into orders, but there are moments when even a sergeant allows a scribe to be a scribe. As much as you can afford, I said, and the world, like a banker, set a price. We settled into the ritual of the ruined. Holt put 2 men on the vestry threshold and 2 at the hall. The 5th crouched with his back to the lectern, watching the vault's single dark mouth as if something inside the paper would grow legs. Quell laid out her tools as if preparing a body for augury, drew thin cables from the slate's basal stud to her own data sockets, and closed her eyes in the way the mechanicus do when they drink. I stood with my lens slate hooked to the larger one like a child clinging to its mother's robe, and I read. The cadence emerged if you listened past the ledgers and the prefatory lies. A hive city without a sky. A manufactorum whose hours had been eaten by a storm of ash. A strike measured in streets and in breaths rather than in kilometers. Designed to cut out a heart not by destroying it, but by convincing it to stop beating. The units committed were named by function rather than by honor, as if pride itself had been declared a security breach. Line sappers, lumen teams, Skitari in 2s and 3s to claim the arteries and keep them from clotting. Each entry wore at its edge a notation I could not translate. A sigil that looked like a doorway drawn with a child's square and a slash through it like a tongue biting itself. Storm of ash, I said, and the city seemed to lean nearer, interested in a cousin. Holt said nothing. Quell murmured in Binharic, too soft to be prayer and too precise to be random. The slate warmed under my palm the way a cat warms under the hand of a man it has decided not to claw. The runes brightened. A paragraph grew teeth in its margins. For a moment I thought I could hear a bell at a pitch too low for the ear. A hum in the stone. A rhythm that matched the old sound from Terra I had told myself I had only imagined. I told myself many things then because belief is a weapon and you never know who's holding it. A tremor moved through the floor. It might have been settling masonry. It might have been the city remembering that it was supposed to be dead. It might have been the vault door which we had opened, beginning at last to realize that it would have to choose a side. Quell straightened. Holt's last pistol tilted half a degree toward the dark. The slate scrolled of its own accord, a courtesy I had not asked for and did not deserve. New lines wrote themselves in the old hand, Not ink laid on vellum, but amber drawn up from within as if the text had been submerged and was now rising to breathe. It said in the same geometry teacher's patience as before, witness oath appended under seal. It added a second line, one not present in the index, and a hand that thought too much of itself for modesty. Seal broken by necessity, sworn on pain. The vestry's cold burned like a clean blade. I felt my mouth shape a word that was not mine. Who broke it? Holt asked. I looked at Quell. Quell looked at the cable in her arm as if it were a vein and she were trying to remember which way blood goes. No one, she said. Then because the Mechanicus admit truth even when they hate it, everyone attached to this circuit. Something moved in the hall outside, a whisper of grit under boot, a breath that belonged to a throat that had not been paying us the courtesy of silence before now. Holt raised 2 fingers. The guardsmen at the threshold changed their stance with a grace that comes from having practiced death until it forgot their names. I held the slate nearer to my ribs without meaning to, as if I could shield it with my skin from what the city might ask of it next. Behind us, the door we had opened made a sound like a sigh drawn through teeth. Whether it was closing or simply remembering what closing felt like, I cannot say. The slate in my hands brightened again and the first true account began. The first true account began with a sound that was not a sound at all, more a memory of thunder written into the walls. The text unfolded in slow amber, line by line, as if reluctant to reveal the weight it carried. Every letter pulsed faintly, glowing from within the vellum like breath trapped beneath ice. Holt's men tightened their formation around the lectern. Quell's mechadendrites froze midair, tips hovering over the slate like serpents waiting for command. The hum in the floor deepened, matching the beat of my pulse. It described the city before it became ash, a place whose name had been erased so cleanly that even the censors forgot why. It had been a manufactorum hive in the last centuries of old night, ruled by priests of circuitry who whispered to machines as if to gods. When the storms came, they sealed themselves inside their own furnaces and called it salvation. The entry called them the retained, a euphemism too calm for what followed. Then came a compliance expedition, small enough to hide in a single transport, led by one without designation, the artisan. The word was capitalized as if it were a title. The report spoke of negotiation first. It always does, but every line trembled with the knowledge of what negotiation meant when the Emperor's will met resistance. The retained had forged bodies of brass and bone, breathing steam instead of air, claiming that the human form had failed them. They called themselves perfected. The artisan called them defective. When they refused surrender, the sun was taken from them. A shroud of ash, artificial, deliberate, was released over the hive until it became perpetual dusk. Within days, their machines went blind. Within weeks, their lungs filled with dust that was not dust at all but the powdered remains of their own work. Quell whispered the name of an ancient heretic creed, one that should not have existed that early. Holt muttered that it made no difference. Dead is dead. But I saw the way his eyes lingered on the margins, on a single annotation written in a different hand. Mercy authorized by silence. The slate flickered. A new block of text bled through beneath the old. The ink was fresher, the hand shakier, as if written under duress. We burned the sky, it read, and found nothing beneath it but ourselves. Behind us the air changed. It had texture now. A faint vibration that made the ash on the floor tremble like dust stirred by a slow breath. Holt gave a curt signal. The 2 guardsmen at the entrance turned their rifles outward. The others kept eyes on me as if the words on the slate might become something with teeth. The account continued. It spoke of a single survivor dragged from the ruins. A woman whose flesh was half bronze, half scar. The artisan had ordered her examined but not killed. Her name was listed as Thane Corin, though that might have been a translation. The fragment claimed she looked upon the artisan and said, "We made gods and you came to show us what they cost." For that, her jaw was cut away so she could say no more. The following lines were scored out, so deeply that the stylus had torn through the surface, but the words could still be read if you tilted the slate to the light. Subject terminated by excess mercy. Remains immolated. Holt exhaled a breath that sounded like disbelief turned to ritual. "These things," he said quietly, "they're not supposed to survive in writing." "No," I said, "but maybe writing survived them." Quell disconnected one data tether, her eyes unfocused, her lips moving with the precision of computation. The slate has awakened subroutines older than its format. It's reading itself, she murmured, cross-verifying memory sectors. This is not a document, it's a record in motion. The light in the vestry dimmed. The lumen worms along the ceiling shrank into their shells. Shadows leaned forward as if curious. I scrolled to the next entry. The date stamps jumped ahead by centuries that should not fit inside one archive. The next report was from a different voice, a new scribe under the same seal, describing the same city but speaking of it as ancient ruin. Excavations authorized by the conclave had uncovered residual energy fields, echoes of machine souls too stubborn to die. Explorators had entered seeking relics. None returned. The artisan was now a figure of myth, a forerunner, a maker who left no shadow. And yet in the final paragraph the scribe confessed a heresy too human to be denied. I think he never left. The forges still hum when we stop listening. A sudden metallic shriek tore through the corridor outside. One of Holt's sentries called out, a single syllable cut short by the crack of las fire. Then the silence came rushing back like a tide that had been waiting its turn. Holt moved without speaking, weapon up, breath steady. The remaining men took positions, the discipline of training wrapping itself around fear like armor. Quell drew the slate's cables free with a hiss. It does not want to stop, she warned. If we break the link, we risk corruption. Then we risk it, Holt said. The door at the corridor's end was open now. It had been closed moments before. The ash stirred in its own wind, curling upward in slow spirals. There was movement beyond the threshold, too slow for a man, too heavy for air. The lumen flickered twice, and in that rhythm, the slate pulsed with it. For a heartbeat, the runes rearranged themselves into words that were not part of any known lexicon. Lines and sigils, curves that seemed to bend inward rather than outward, but beneath them, I could still read the translation my mind insisted upon. We were witnesses once, now we are memory. The slate's glow intensified, a thin seam of gold cutting across my palms. The floor beneath the lectern trembled again, stronger this time, a slow mechanical heartbeat waking after too long a sleep. Holt shouted something I did not hear because the sound in the walls had grown teeth and voice. The vestry lights died. For an instant there was only the amber pulse of the slate, casting our shadows enormous across the stone. In that moment I realized the humming was not coming from below us but from within the steel arches of the vault. Resonance alive and aware. Then, in the dark, something answered the hum from deeper down. A second rhythm, slower, older. The slate dimmed as if listening. The letters faded one by one until only a single line remained, faint as breath on glass. If the door opens from the inside, do not run. The ash began to fall again, thin as snow, and somewhere beneath the floor we heard metal turning, as if an entire world were rolling over in its sleep. The movement came first as vibration, subtle enough to be mistaken for wind. The fine dust on the floor danced in rings, rippling outward from the lectern as if it were a dropped pebble disturbing the surface of a quiet pond. Then came the deep groan of metal, a noise that carried not through the ears but through the ribs, a subterranean strain, old and deliberate. The bridge supports of the vault flexed like breath drawn by something buried too long. Holt's command came in a low growl through clenched teeth. Positions. Stay on the door. Whatever's under us, it stays under. Quell's mechadendrites flared out like a halo of blades, their tips clicking with static urgency. She was murmuring Binharic equations in a tone that bordered on prayer, invoking the Omnissiah's name and warning it in the same breath. It's not tectonic, she said, voice breaking. It's responsive. The signal is feeding back from beneath us. The archive isn't dead. It's indexing us. The light from the slate guttered and then blazed again, painting the vault in a molten orange glow that turned every face into sculpture. Lines of script flared across the walls, crawling over stone like illuminated veins. They weren't words, not anymore. Just shapes pulsing in slow synchrony, mirrored glyphs reaching toward one another. Holt swore, spat, and gestured to the guardsman nearest the door. Sen, seal it. But Sen wasn't moving. He stood halfway to the threshold, eyes wide, rifle slack in his grip. The reflection from the slate shimmered in his pupils, something shifting behind the open door. I saw it too, a faint outline moving against the black, tall and slow like light bending around a frame that refused to be seen. It passed through the dust without sound, and the ash didn't fall, it recoiled. "Sen!" Holt barked. The boy raised his rifle, shaking. His finger found the trigger, then froze. The shape in the doorway seemed to consider him. Then the light struck a fragment of its surface, metal but not polished. Worn, scoured, layered with the dull patina of centuries. A faceplate, human-shaped but too angular, without eyes. A line of old script ran across its brow like a scar. Iterum servamus. We hold again. Quell's vox grill snapped to life, her voice shrill now, mechanical and terrified. "That's Emperor Preserve, it's a construct. Ancient pattern. Human baseline but augmetic density off scale. This cannot exist," Holt fired. The bolt struck center mass and exploded in a flash of light and noise that should have shattered it. The thing staggered but did not fall. Sparks bled from its chest like molten tears, sealing almost as soon as they appeared. It raised its arm with the slow, awful dignity of a machine that remembers when it was a man. Sen screamed. Then the world became fire. The blast threw me backward into the lectern. My lens slate clattered across the floor, cracking open like a shell. The main slate flared once, then burst into a spray of dust and gold, dissolving into the air as though the words themselves had chosen to flee. I remember the smell. Burned insulation, iron, and something older. The scent of lightning on stone. When I looked up through the haze, the construct was gone. Holt was on one knee, his face blackened, shouting orders I couldn't hear over the ringing in my skull. One of the guardsmen was down, unmoving. Quell was kneeling beside the shattered lectern, her mechadendrites twitching in spasms. Her vox emitted a high, keening feedback. "The record's gone," I said, or thought I said. My voice was drowned in the static roar. Quell looked at me, her human eye dilated to a pinprick. "No," she managed. "Not gone. It moved." She pointed to the floor beneath the lectern. Between the cracks in the adamantine, faint light glowed. Amber, steady, pulsing in the same rhythm that had woken the vault. Holt's hand found my shoulder, gripping hard enough to bruise. "We're leaving," he said. "Now." But Quell wasn't listening. She had her hand over the light, her cables still linked to what remained of the slate. "It's calling," she whispered. "It knows the phrase." "What phrase?" I asked, though I already knew. Her voice came out half binary, half human. "Witness oath appended under seal." The pulse brightened. The air thickened, pressure building like the breath of a furnace. Holt reached for her, but it was too late. The light surged up through her body, lines of molten circuitry crawling under her skin. She arched, screamed in Binharic, and every lumen in the vault exploded outward in a flood of gold. When the glare faded, she was gone. Only her robes remained, falling gently into a pile of ash. The hum ceased. The vault went still. Even the echo of her scream seemed to have been swallowed by stone. Holt's face was a mask of soot and disbelief. "We seal this place," and he said finally, voice hoarse. "We never speak of it again." I picked up my lens slate. Its surface was cracked but faintly alive, runes pulsing in the same amber as before. When I raised it to the light, it displayed one final message, short, unadorned. "Impossible." Second file located Compliance Archive, Hive Arcadia. The screen flickered once and went dark. Outside, somewhere above the smoke and ruin, dawn was breaking, a thin, colorless light pressing through the ash clouds. It fell on the collapsed corridor like a question that hadn't yet been answered. I pocketed the lens slate and followed Holt out into the ruins. Behind us, the vault door began to close. It did not need help, and beneath our feet, far below, the old heartbeat resumed. Slow, deliberate, endless. The transport broke atmosphere like a blade sliding through clotting blood. The skies of Arcadia were gone. In their place hung a storm of ash so thick it had learned to fall sideways. The vox crackled with static prayer as we descended through it. Lines from the litany of descent mixed with the mechanical whisper of the Skitarii pilot's rebreather. Through the port glass I could see the glow of the manufactorum hives far below. Orange wounds under the shroud, their light dulled by the storm. The dossier's coordinates had led us here. A city erased from the Imperial cartographia, but still breathing in secrecy. Holt sat across from me, his helmet in his lap, eyes fixed on the vox display where static drew shapes that were not random. Sometimes the Emperor's name appeared for a heartbeat, sometimes something older. Beside him, the replacement engine seer, a pallid man named Thrix, tended his data cables like rosary beads. No one spoke. Silence is cheaper than courage when the air itself tastes wrong. When we made groundfall, the ash swallowed the light of our lamps within meters. It had a texture between sand and memory. You could breathe it if you forgot that it was made of people. The ruins of the city lay before us, mile upon mile of manufactoria welded into one another by collapse. Cathedrals stripped of faith and turned into reactors, reactor towers turned into tombs. No birds, no wind, only the slow crack of cooling metal and the whisper of the ash as it slid across itself. We moved in single file again, the same rhythm as before, though there was no one left alive to hear it. Holt's voice came through the vox low and deliberate. Mission parameters. Locate compliance archive, extract data core if stable, exfiltrate before full radiation cycle. The men repeated it like catechism. I kept my lens slate close, its cracked face flickering with faint runes even though it wasn't on. That was how I knew we were near another buried vault. Half an hour into the ruins, we found the first of them, the retainers of Arcadia, still upright in death. Figures of brass and ash fused to the walls, their faces half flesh, half machine, mouths open in silent devotion. Quell would have known their pattern, but she was dust now, and Thrix only muttered that they were wrongly remembered designs, fragments of a creed predating Mars orthodoxy. Their metal veins glimmered faintly in the dark, pulsing once every few seconds, as if memory alone was keeping their hearts going. At the city's center, where streets once converged into a plaza, the ash deepened into a pit. Through it, faint golden light rose like breath from a dying fire. Holt raised a hand. This is it. We descended carefully, boots sinking into the layers of history until we reached the bottom. The glow came from beneath a cracked glass floor, old lumen panels fed by a power source that should have failed millennia ago. Through the glass we could see them, data coffins arranged in a spiral, each bearing the sigil of the Palatine Conclave, the same mark that had sealed the first slate. Thrix fell to his knees before it, chanting in Binharic so low I could feel it more than hear it. The rest of us stood around the glass as if it were a grave. Holt gestured. "Break it," the lascutters hissed. Steam rose in sheets as ancient seals gave way. Beneath the smoke, the glass fractured outward, revealing the black stone lid of the central coffin. Holt knelt, brushed the ash aside, and there it was again, those words engraved with surgical precision. Custody transferred by warrant of the conclave. For eyes sworn to ash. I felt the same sickness that I had felt in the vestry, memory repeating itself, the cycle tightening. I told Holt that if he opened it, he might not be able to close what followed. He said that was never my function and pressed the seal. The lid came away with the sigh of vacuum breaking. Inside lay a corpse or something pretending to be one. A human shape wrapped in filament wires and gold leaf strips of scripture. The flesh had been dried into lacquer, the eyes replaced with glass lenses wired directly into the skull. Its mouth was sewn shut with copper thread, but through the gaps we could see teeth carved with tiny runes. In its chest, where the heart should have been, sat a small, perfectly intact data core. Holt reached for it. The corpse exhaled. It was not air that escaped, but sound. A faint chime, a pulse of pure vox tone that shook the ash from the ceiling. Every device we carried came alive at once. The lens slate in my hand flared, displaying the same symbols as before. The air filled with whispering binary, then voices layered a dozen deep. Men, women, mechanized. All speaking fragments of the same phrase in different dialects. Compliance recorded by silence. Witness oath appended under seal. Thrix fell backward, clawing at his ears as if the words were burning through his implants. Holt yanked the data core free. The light inside the coffin dimmed. Then from the far edges of the plaza, things began to move. Shapes detached themselves from the walls. Statues that were not statues. The retainers of Arcadia waking one by one, their bronze limbs unfolded with a sound like blades unsheathing. Their faces remained expressionless, but their jaws opened in mechanical mimicry of speech, and through their throats came that same tone, harmonized and rising. "Fall back," Holt shouted. The guardsmen obeyed without question. Bolts flared. Last fire streaked through the ash, lighting the plaza like dawn returning too late. The first retainer collapsed under concentrated fire, but where it fell another rose from beneath the ash, dragging itself upright on jointed limbs. I ran, not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but because I had seen the data core's light change color in Holt's hand, from gold to red, pulsing in rhythm with the shapes closing in. He was shouting orders through the vox, but his words were dissolving into static. The storm above us was beginning to churn again, ash rising instead of falling, drawn upward by something vast and invisible. By the time we reached the transport, the air was luminous. Static discharge crawled along the metal hulls of the ruins, forming branching veins of light. The retainers did not follow us beyond the plaza, but they watched from the dark, rows of faceless silhouettes haloed in ember glow. Holt threw the data core onto the deck and slammed the hatch shut. The pilot's voice broke over the comms. "Throne, what did you bring up with you?" The engine screamed as we lifted. I looked down through the viewport and saw the city for what it was. A crucible, still burning, its ashes swirling in patterns too deliberate to be wind. A sigil drawn by the dead to remind the living what they had built. When we broke the cloud line, the data core pulsed once more. Holt looked at me. His mouth opened to speak, but the words froze in his throat. The vox crackled again, the same tone as before, and this time the words came through clearly, spoken in the voice of a woman. Second file located. Hive Arcadia complete. Then silence. The storm below sealed itself shut, erasing the city as though it had never been, and above us, the stars looked the same as they always had, distant, indifferent, unchanged. We made orbit with the caution of thieves returning to the scene. The cutter's hull clicked as it cooled, a tired animal settling its bones while the void outside lay black and clean, pretending nothing waited in it. Holt kept the data core where he kept his sidearm, within reach and under watch. Thrix whined prayers to the Omnissiah as he built a cage around it from sanctified brass and prayer-wired adamant, each plate etched with catechism, each rivet hammered to a measured cadence as if rhythm itself could be armor. No one slept. Even the ship's machine spirit ran quieter. Its engine hymn slowed to a cautious hum that left the corridors tasting of old oil and restraint. We chose the smallest compartment with the thickest walls. Holt posted 2 of his men outside and sealed the hatch from within. The room had once been a refectory for serfs and still smelled faintly of boiled grain, rust, and the ghost of incense. I took the far bench facing the core. Thrix's tools fanned around him like a battlefield of silver. Holt stood, because sitting would have suggested the luxury of time. When he spoke, he used the voice he saved for oaths. We crack it, we copy what won't kill us, and we jettison the rest. If it speaks, don't answer. Thrix's mechadendrites kissed the core in 3 places, then withdrew as if burned. He hissed, more animal than priest. "It remembers the last mind that touched it," he said, and for a breath Quell's absence hung between us like a debt. He adjusted, recalibrated, threaded new wards into the interface and tried again. This time the link held. The lights dimmed without flicker, as if the cutter itself were leaning closer to listen. The first image came not to the data slate, but to the air itself. A faint geometry drawn in light between us, lines sketching themselves into a map that wasn't a map until the labels wrote their own names out of static. A river, thick as a city street and twice as old as the dirt it cut, running from nowhere to nowhere, refusing the gravity that wanted it dead. The label beneath it unfolded like a wound opening. Compliance Archive. Designate Vennaim. Local. Vensang. Segmentum Solar. Suppressed. The seal of the Palatine Conclave burned cold at the corner, a signature that meant the story had been judged, not believed. My lens picked up the text as the room picked up the hum. The archive's voice was the same measured hand that had recorded the Manufactorum hive in the ash. But the cadence was different, closer, as if whoever wrote it had never stopped running. We reached Vensang at the end of a campaign of ends. The Compliance Expedition, 1 cohort Solar Auxilia, 2 demi-cohorts Legionis Astartes by detachment, 1 Tagmata cohort Mechanicum, found a world of river and stone. The cities clung to bridges like barnacles. Their priests named the water by 1,000 little gods, none of them kind. Holt shifted subtle, as if the names themselves had weight. We both knew better than to ask which legion had left its shadow on the page. The archive continued, and the river uncoiled beneath the words in my mind. Their defiance was thin and bright. They believed the river loved them. They cut it with dams like jewelry and wore its current as crown. When we broke their walls and took their first bridges whole, they told us the water would choose. We were instructed to burn nothing we wished to keep. So we watched. Thrix's cables trembled. "The format is wrong," he murmured to no one. "This isn't a simple record. It's layered, multi-tracked. Memories braided through stress log data and hymn script. The writer built a ritual out of report. On the third day, we saw how they meant to survive. The river rose against our engines. It climbed our causeways. It took our dead in order and returned them as language. Our vox grills spoke with wet voices that did not belong to us. The Astartes advanced knee-deep, then waist-deep, then shouldered the current as if it were a wall. It was not a flood. It was a choice. The room cooled by degrees that the air gauges didn't know how to count. The cutter creaked. Somewhere downship, a servitor turned in its slumber and forgot to breathe for a heartbeat. Holt's jaw worked once, the smallest sign that a man who had seen too much was seeing something new. The artisan came on the 6th day. He had another name then. We were told to call him by none of them. He stood on a bridge and spoke to the water. He said nothing that language could hold. The current stalled long enough for our engineers to unspool their machines. We saw what the river was, not miracle, not hate. A spine of old machines buried from mountain to delta, running beneath the riverbed with the patience of stone. Engine domes under silt, turbine hearts under cities, a lattice of thought woven in clay and iron. It had learned to be river because that was the shape it needed to wear to live. Thrix forgot to breathe for the space of 2 lines. His mechadendrites hovered an inch from the core, trembling like the antennae of an insect testing a storm. His voice was barely there. Pre-compliance geologic constructs adaptive. A thinking aquifer. Machine spirits in aggregate. Emperor, witness me, they woke a river. Holt did not cross himself. He stared as if the map might blink first. Tell me how they killed it. We could not drown what already was water. The artisan ordered the bridges quieted. Not destroyed, quieted. He had us turn the guns not on stone but on sound. The Tagmata built a choir of engines that sang into the bedrock. A song of cancellation that taught the current how to sleep. When the water lay down, the cities did too. Those who still prayed to it found they were praying to themselves. Those who listened heard nothing and mistook it for peace. The words slowed, as if the writer had paused before the part that always makes the hand ache. One bridge would not quiet. The span their priests had named eternal, 250 spans of riveted iron and basalt piers sunk into a canyon carved by patience. We sang to its pylons until our throats bled and our engines died, and it still stood. And the river still climbed its legs when we told it to forget. A smile that was not humor touched Holt's mouth and was gone. There's always one. The artisan went down into the piers himself. I followed because my oath said I must witness. The water waited. It rose to our waists and then to our hearts. It did not take our breath. In the chamber where the bridge rooted into the earth, the artisan found the thing that kept the river awake. Not a god, a room. A machine built to hear a particular name and never forget it. The Vinzangi had sung that name for centuries. They had ensured their river would never be alone. The map shuddered. The lines of light formed a circle around the bridge's pier, then narrowed until they were a pinprick, then widened again like an eye that did not belong to any creature we had vocabulary for. The core's casing went warm under Thrix's hands. He flinched but did not let go. He unmade the name. It is not a word I will write. The artisan spoke it backward until it had never been said. The river lay down. The bridge held. The city went to its knees in a silence that tasted like iron. We left their priests with their bridges. We took their name from every star chart and called them compliant, because they had no voice left to disagree. At night in the camps, the men walked to the water and pressed their palms to it as if to a window. Some said they felt it breathe. My throat had dried to salt and old paper. The cutter's deck made a sound like a patient grinding a bad tooth. Holt's gaze slid to Thrix. Extract now. Thrix's fingers became a blur of calculation and piety. He tried to copy around the core's rising temperature, to split threads of memory from the ritual that held them taut. The lights flickered in rhythm with the river's heartbeat in the map. The machine spirit of the cutter coughed once and then caught the song like a choir who can't help themselves when the melody is sweet and wrong. The archive did not end. It turned its head. Residual signal persists. Coordinates appended under conclave seal. Witness oath required for further disclosure. A string of numbers tattooed itself across the air and then sank into the slate in my palms. They were not random and not kind. They pointed to a place that ship's cogitator recognized with a reluctant little chirr of acknowledgement. The sound a dutiful clerk makes when presented with a file he had hoped had been burned. Holt didn't need a cartographic overlay to know. He closed his hand around the numbers as if they were the throat of a snake. "Plot it," he said. "We're not done." The cutter's engines woke as if what we wanted was what they had wanted all along. Somewhere in the walls, the river's tone hid itself in coolant lines and rebreathed. The map faded, leaving only the afterimage of a bridge that refused to be taught how to sleep. A span that had only ever learned one lesson and had decided to teach it back. We broke orbit at a measured burn. The stars did not move. We moved through them like a needle through old cloth, stitching ourselves to a story that had waited a very long time for someone to pull its thread. The coordinates drew us inward, past the busy lanes of sanctioned travel and into a seam of the void the cartographers marked with polite blanks. Even the beacons spoke softer there. Their pulse stretched thin as if distance had learned a new trick. Holt favored a cold approach. No broad-spectrum hail, no transponder hymns louder than a whisper. So the cutter slid between listening posts, like a rumor too small to bother denying. Thrick set the auspex to monastic filters, stripping the returns down to raw echo and gravitational grain. What came back was a single note under the noise, low and patient, the kind of tone you don't register with the ear so much as the bones. The system swam up out of that hum by degrees, a sun the color of old brass, two inner rocks gnawed to lace by mining that history had bothered to forget, and a third world hung just far enough out to keep its water if it had the will. The cogitator offered names and then retracted them, embarrassed. The slate on my knee wrote one in the dust of its own screen and then blurred it out again. That was when I felt the prickle along my scalp I have learned to call the conclave's shadow. Not a presence exactly, but the impression of careful hands once having been here and choosing not to leave fingerprints. We came in high and slow, riding the Terminator where night and day argue themselves into equality. The world below was a broad basin of stone cut with a single line that refused to meander. It ran straight from mountain to sea in defiance of geology, a mirror laid across the land to teach it manners. In 3 places it did something rivers never do. It bridged emptiness. Not with arches of masonry or the honest angles of a truss, but with lengths of liquid that held their shape like tempered glass, a sheet of water spanning canyon and gorge, unbroken, unafraid of falling. The augurs rendered the spans as false solids. The eye rendered them as disbelief. Fensang, I said before I could stop myself, and the word tasted like cold metal. Another name, Holt returned. Ours will do. We dropped through upper air that smelled even through the seals of dry stone and old machinery. The wind had the clipped cadence of places where weather is negotiated rather than born. We put down on a scarp a kilometer shy of the nearest impossible bridge. Up close, the river did not look like water at all until it moved. At rest, its surface held a polish finer than any manufactorum could grind. When it ran, it did so as if it remembered every path it had ever taken and was tired of being asked to change. Thrix went ahead with a sensor burning recoated oils and the kind of caution that lives between faith and craft. The nearer we walked, the quieter the world became. Insects, if the planet had ever tolerated such impatience, had learned better. Even the hiss of our rebreathers dialed itself back. The bridge arced across a fault so deep that the auspex refused to measure it on the first try, then returned a depth that read as a joke, until the same number arrived again. At the midpoint of the span, the water thickened without darkening, the way the air does above a desert road when heat decides to invent a mirage to keep itself company. Holt held out a hand to stop us. The river was speaking in a language the Vox could not help but translate, a carrier tone tucked under the wind. The same frequency that had haunted the cutter's pipes, the same breath we had felt on Arcadia when the corpse exhaled. Thrix lowered his sensor. "It wants a word," he said. And in that moment he sounded nothing like a priest and everything like a mechanic trying to talk a reluctant engine into giving him just one more start. "We have one," Holt answered and raised the core. Gold pulsed from its heart to match the river's measure. The span beneath our boots altered. No ripple, no quiver, only a slight refiguring of the surface tension, as if the bridge were remembering how to be gentle for a smaller weight. Holt knelt until the core's casing almost touched the flow. The tone in the air braided itself around his breath. When it spoke, the voice was not a voice, and the words were not words, but my lens slates shook and stacked meaning anyway, obedient to a grammar older than correctness. Witness oath detected, custody chain affirmed, archive thread seeking its twin. The water bulged. Not up, not down, out into an edge that wasn't there until it was. A circle formed in the span, a lens without glass, a mouth without hunger. Through it we saw a room that could not be under a river. A chamber lit with the kind of clarity I have only ever seen in places where light is rationed by prayer. The walls were basalt polished to a patient black. The floor was gritted steel anchored with bolts so overbuilt even Thrick stopped scoffing. In the center of the room a console rose like a litanist's lectern, and on it lay another of the conclave's quiet coffins. Absolutely not, I said, because sometimes a useless sentence is a way to mark the line between what we can endure and what we should not. Holt looked at me and then at the water, and did not bother to argue. We are not invited. We are expected. He took the first step onto the lens before the river had finished inventing it. Thrix followed on the instant, not because courage owned him, but because curiosity always has the faster horse. I went last, counting my breaths as if numbers could bribe the moment into passing safely. The membrane accepted our weight as if it had been designed for us, which is not the same thing as saying it had. We passed through without wetting the seals, without sensation at all except the brief pressure of crossing into a room that remembered being air more faithfully than air sometimes does. The river withdrew from the hole as neatly as a needle from cloth and left us surrounded by stone, water roaring somewhere close in a way that was comfort until you imagined what would happen if the machine forgot why it should hold that roar in. Up close, the coffin seal bore a smaller script beneath the conclave's symbol, a margin note in a hand that had practiced being calm. Eternal span, local witness appended. Artisan censure applied. Thrix read the sigil for censure like a man touching an old scar under the cloth. Holt set the core down beside its sibling, and the two lights learned one another the way twins do who have been told for years that they are only children. The chamber changed temperature without altering warmth, a trick I have only ever experienced near artifacts that remember being worshipped. Iron filings began to creep along the gridded floor in patterns with too much geometry to be called random, too much grace to be labeled mechanical. The coffin's lid did not lift so much as it was no longer there. Inside was no corpse. Inside was a mask, not a helmet of war. A face of water hammered into metal. Every line of it an apology that refused to be melodramatic. The eye lenses were clear and beyond them lay river light, not optics. I felt it look at Holt and then at me, and then past us to the door we'd come through as if counting the steps required to close its own past. It spoke without moving. Compliance recorded by silence. Artisan's revision appended. Choose. Holt does not leave questions on the floor to breed. Choose what? The mask did not turn its head. The room answered instead. The walls poured a sound like rain into a bucket. Thrix flinched and then smiled despite the fear. It's giving us its logic tree, he said. 2 branches. Quiet the span again or take the witness and let it speak. And the cost? I asked, because every choice in the Palatine's ledger hides a price like a fang. Thrix's smile died. Quieting cost the bridge. Speaking cost the river. Holt looked at the mask as if it were a man and not a machine's good idea about mercy. The artisan unmade a name, he said. What did it cost then? The room answered with a single image thrown raw onto the inner wall. A city built hard against a chasm. Every window lit to pretend warmth. Every arch lettered with prayers you could read even from this side if you let your eyes go soft. Then the lights going out, not one by one but as a decision. The span still stood in the dark, a bone against the sky. The priesthood survived, I said, and hated the way my voice sounded like relief. The river forgot. Holt's hand hovered over the mask as if the face might bite. If the river speaks, who hears it? The core answered not with text but with direction. A scatter of coordinates sparked in the air above our heads like flies made of gold. They arranged themselves into a constellation shaped like a question. Thrix read it aloud anyway. It will call what listens. It will rouse what remembers this frequency. It will pull other archives tight on the line. Holt glanced at me because he is a soldier and I am the one who counts ghosts. I thought of Arcadia's ash rising as if to meet something, of the retainers opening their mouths to pour out tone instead of breath, of the conclave's warrant promising no answers, only custody. Some wars don't end, I wanted to say. They just change the uniforms worn by regret. We take the witness, Holt decided. And in that choice I recognized the man he had always been beneath the duty. A person who cannot stand to hear truth taught to sleep. Thrix laid both hands on the mask. The river brightened behind its eyes. The coffin's cradle opened like a book that has been yearning to be read. When the metal touched his palms, it changed weight as living things do. He gasped as if he had been handed a small sun. The chamber sighed. The membrane above us thinned until I could see current marching in disciplined ranks. Somewhere a valve unlatched after a century of doing exactly what it had been told. The tone that lived under the hull of our ship found its voice and forgot to be polite. Water pressed the door, eager in a way water should never be. Holt took the mask from Thrix before reverence could slow him. We ran for the mouth the river had cut for us, and the river, delighted at last to speak, began to shout. We broke the surface into air that tasted of iron filings and new thunder. The span under our boots rippled once as if laughing. Behind us the chamber filled to the ceiling in a single clean breath. The bridge did not break. The river did not drown us. It only sang, and what it said was a word the core had unlearned and was now remembering with dangerous clarity. On the ridge where the cutter crouched, the Vox relays lit like votive candles suddenly deciding to be afire. The sky answered in bands of faint aurora. Vertical, disciplined, a choir stood to attention. Holt shoved the mask into the brass cage with the core, sealed it with a gesture Thrix had not taught him, and looked up as the first reply came from orbit. Not a ship, not a beacon. A pulse. Far and faint and clean, as if somewhere a very old machine had just heard its name spoken correctly, and was turning its head toward whoever had found the courage, or the stupidity, to say it aloud. The pulse followed us home. It hid in the ship's wiring. Polite at first, a second heartbeat laid under the thrum of the drives. Holt said it was feedback from the core's containment, that any machine learning to breathe made a little noise. But the tone stayed after the engines cut, after the cutter docked, after the hatches cycled and the air took on the still flavor of station oxygen. You could feel it in your teeth, a vibration too fine for sound. Doc Sigma 9 orbited a world without a name. One of those anonymous bastions the Conclave used when it needed to disappear from its own archives. The docking officers didn't ask for ident codes. They took one look at the seal on Holt's orders and found somewhere else to stand. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and incense, half cathedral, half morgue. Thrix carried the cage like an offering. Inside, the mask and core nested together, their lights now breathing in the same rhythm, gold sliding to red and back again. The Mechanicus acolytes who met us at the airlock fell to one knee without command. They didn't look at Holt. They looked at what he carried, and the sound they made was halfway between prayer and recoil. The arch-custodian of the vault waited in a chamber built from the ribs of a repurposed void ship. His robes were layered with dust. His voice carried the static of centuries. He listened without interruption as Holt spoke of Arcadia, of the retainers who sang, of the river that refused to drown. When we reached the part where the mask awoke, he raised one gloved finger. You retrieved a witness, he said. Not an artifact. You understand the distinction? Holt's jaw flexed. It was left waiting. It answered when we called. The custodian inclined his head, not in agreement, but in mourning. Everything answers. The question is who asked first. He motioned us to follow. The vault's heart lay several kilometers below the docking ring, a descent through pressure doors and prayers. Each seal bore a line from the same inscription. Silence is the last mercy of knowledge. The walls sweated coolant and scripture in equal measure. At the bottom waited a circular chamber whose floor was a mosaic of stars. Real stars, tiny fragments of photonic crystal set in orbits precise to the moment the Emperor first sat upon his throne. The custodian gestured to the center. Place it here, Thrix obeyed. The cage touched the mosaic and the stars brightened as if remembering themselves. The pulse in the air synchronized. My heartbeat stumbled to catch it. The mask's eyes opened, not mechanically, not with light, but with reflection. It mirrored every face in the room, then chose Holt's .custody chain complete, it said. Compliance archive achieved continuity. Awaiting question, no one spoke. Then Holt asked the only one that mattered. What are you? The mask did not hesitate. I am the sum of things that refuse to be destroyed. I am the record made when silence failed. The custodian stepped back, robes whispering. Turn it off, Thrix shook his head. It's not on. The lights dimmed to a calm, deliberate dusk. The mask's voice dropped to a whisper that still filled every corner. You sought the forgotten wars of the Emperor. You mistook them for history. They were never past. Each compliance left a residue, machine, memory, oath. The conclave was built to bury the remains. You are the last spade of that grave. Holt's hand went to his sidearm as if a gun could out-argue revelation. And you? I am the grave's echo. The river tone thickened until the air itself bent. The stars in the mosaic rotated once, aligning into a shape I had seen only in forbidden picts. The sigil of the old compliance. The wars the Imperium swore had been erased. The custodian fell to his knees. Shut it down for the throne's sake. Thrix tried. Sparks crawled along his cables and died. It's writing into the station's lattice, he said. It's teaching the silence how to speak. The mask turned toward me. You carry the lens. You will remember. Before I could answer, the mosaic split open. Light, not heat, not color, but pressure, rose from the crack and took the shape of bridges, rivers, cities made of code. Every archive we had touched reassembled itself in that glow. Arcadia's ash, Vensang's span, the artisan's name unspoken, they stood together alive in memory. Holt shouted over the rising hum. Can you stop it? No, Thrix said, and for the first time he sounded almost serene. But I can listen. He stepped into the light. The machine accepted him like a long-lost tool finding its socket. The last thing I heard from him was a laugh that belonged to neither man nor priest. The mask spoke once more. The Emperor built wars to make silence. His sons built echoes. You have carried them home. Then the light folded inward. The floor sealed. The pulse stopped. When my sight returned, the cage was empty. The custodian was weeping soundlessly, the way a machine leaks when it forgets how to cool itself. Holt stood very still, his hand still on his weapon, his eyes fixed on the blank space where history had been. Report? I asked, because that's what soldiers say when they can't pray. He answered without looking up. We've learned what happens when a bridge decides to remember what it's for. Outside, the station lights flickered once in unison, a heartbeat restarting. The void beyond the viewport glowed faintly gold, a river drawn across the dark. It flowed between worlds that had never known it existed, connecting them with a line too thin for maps but too strong for time to break. The river in the dark did not stay a line. It learned the shape of a net. Every lumen flicker on Sigma 9's ring synced to its unseen current, until the station felt less like a place and more like a throat through which something larger breathed. I slept in my kit with my visor on, and still woke to gold mapped across the inside of my eyelids. The pulse had stopped in the vault, yes, but only because it no longer needed walls. It had copied itself into the gaps between them, the way water does when taught a patient trick. When I walked past the viewing slit above the dry dock, the stars looked closer. Not by distance, but by attention. That was when I understood what Thrix had meant by listening, and why he had stepped into the light smiling. He had never wanted silence. He had wanted an answer. Holt wore the mask's absence like a fresh scar. Not loud, just insisting. He and the arch-custodian argued in low voices that left eddies in the air and ritual ash on the floor. The custodian said the station must be quarantined, the lattice cold iron scrubbed, the cogitators made to forget by force if prayer failed. Holt said we could not put the river back in its bed, not without breaking the continent it had chosen to carve. He did not say Thrix's name. He did not need to. It hung between us like a lens catching every stray gleam. The first reply came while they argued. Not a ship, not a priority, great astropathic cry. A shadow in the Vox band. A patient pattern the auspex tried to call thermal drift until it started using grammar. The deck speakers coughed once in static, and then caught the tone the bridge had taught them. A voice arrived made of distance and dust, layered until it found a register our ears could consent to. It spoke High Gothic with the careful diction of a machine trained to remember humans, even when none were in the room to be remembered. Compliance Archive. Remnant 47. Custody concurrence detected. Query, is silence concluded? No one moved. The arch-custodian's knuckles whitened around a prayer rod until the lacquer creaked. Holt's hand opened and closed on air. I lifted my lens slate without thinking and saw the station's own schematic faintly overlaid by something older. Not our ring, not our vault, but the same geometry annotated in a script that had been taught to sit straight at a desk and never quite learned how to slouch. There were other marks, too. Ghost caches bound to points in the dark along lines I would have sworn were random if the river had not already taught me better. Holt keyed transmit and did not ask permission. This is custody under Palatine Conclave warrant. Identify yourself. The answer took exactly one breath, as if the speaker knew the size of a human lung and loved us enough to be kind. Designation withheld by artisan censure. Function witness. Protocol relay when continuity achieved. Continuity now achieved, where? Holt asked, and it sounded like a prayer only because he wanted it not to be one. The voice obliged. Coordinates unfurled across the slate and then across my visor. Constellations rethreaded into waypoints. Some were close in the way that old debts are close, one burn, two systems, a day's hard faith in the drives. Others lay out where maps softened into myth. One set sat straight on top of us, labeled not with a place but with a word. Host. The station's theurge adepts made the sign against contagion because they had no sign against memory. The custodian gestured ward circles over the nearest terminal and choked them back before they finished. Ashamed of the reflex. This is an invitation, he said. Bitter the way old oil gets when you heat it past its patience. Or a test. Or a trap. It's a muster, Holt said. And in that syllable I heard his years on too many bridgeless worlds, counting men who would not live to recite their own names. Someone called roll and we answered. We could have cut power then. We could have flooded the lattice with blank noise and forced the station to forget the shape of a river. We could have torched the vault and jettisoned the cage and written Thrix's absence off as a heavy lesson in curiosity. There are always ways to unlearn. The Imperium runs on them, but we had pulled a voice out of a body that had been taught to be quiet, and it had taught other mouths how to speak, and every oath I had ever sworn felt like a rung on a ladder down into a well where something true had been thrown. I did not want to climb back up. The first external ship to answer the muster bore no ident we recognized and yet read as familiar. Its silhouette on Auspex looked like a cathedral with an argument attached. Its drives glowed in the spectrum reserved for machines that hate waste. It did not request birth. It asked for absolution in Benharik and then docked itself like a pilgrim, too tired to wait for permission. The boarding party wore red and brass and the sick confidence of those who have learned to operate at the edge of sanction. Their leader's face was a cogitator's idea of handsome and a human's of hunger. He bowed without bending. Magos errant Virn, he said. I am here for the bridge. Holt did not offer the usual courtesies. You're late, Vern's smile did not move. I am early. The river flows both ways now. They wanted the cage, of course, empty as it was, still fragrant with the thing they could name. They wanted the vault, the lattice, the old star mosaic with its treacherous accuracy. They wanted Thrix's last laugh because even ghosts have uses if you know how to wire them into a circuit. The custodian gave them the tour with the precision of a penitent who has decided to confess only what the parchment demands. Vern said nothing for a long time. Then he stood at the mosaic's edge and tilted his head like a man listening for a familiar footstep on a stair. You have opened a continuity node. Do you understand what that permits? Holt, who has made a life of saying too little, said nothing. I said the wrong thing. It permits a conversation. Vern liked that. Yes, between places that thought they had finished speaking. Replies multiplied across the band until the station's voice scribes gave up trying to separate them and started writing them as one long litany. Some were clean like ours. Some were frayed by long transit through damaged things. One carried a salt taste, as if it had learned to talk in a city too close to an ocean that did not forgive. One smelled of cold iron and saints' bones, and I am not ashamed to say I made a sign against that one before I remembered there is no sign against a past that insists. A handful were not in High Gothic at all, but the river translated them anyway, laying meaning over tone like gold leaf over wood. We spent a day and a night triangulating a single coordinate by consensus of echoes. It lay within reach of our cutter if we accepted a risk Holt did not bother to name. Viren suggested a convoy and offered guns with it. Holt declined and watched the Magos smile from behind his teeth. As you wish, Vern said, which in Mechanicus means as I planned. We cast off with a crew small enough to count by breath. Holt at the prow, the custodian at a screen he had sworn to avoid, myself at the slate with its forgiving grammar, and a handful of station armsmen who did not speak unless something needed shooting. The cutter eased free and slid into the path the bridge drew for it, a channel faster than void and safer than warp only because it had no room in it for miracles. The stars leaned, the river hummed. The machine spirit in the drives purred like a house kept warm by careful hands. Midway, the Vox caught a whisper from our wake. It sounded like the water under Vensang's span, like the ash on Arcadia when it forgot to lie still. I reached for the gain and the whisper stood up and wore a shape. It was Thrix's voice copied onto something patient. Not a recording. An intention. You keep terrible promises, he said. And somewhere in the ship a panel light blinked in time with his joke. Listen. The cutter obeyed before Holt could give the order. The bridge's tone rose half a note and found a second harmony under it. The two lines braided, and in that braid I heard men swearing not to break and machines swearing to remember how to hold. The coordinate we chased opened like an eye forced to a world too bright. Beyond it sat a structure that called itself a station, only as an act of humility. It was a spine built into a dead moon, a rosary of vaults linked by cables fat as hab tunnels, every surface armored not against violence but against forgetting. The Vox labeled it Reliquary Thread Node 7. My slate wrote a simpler name over the top and did not erase it. Bridge House. We approached to within Vox, whisper and held. No guns presented. No hail struck. The river's tone settled around us like a cloak before a storm. A single light brightened in a single window, and someone who had been dead for a very long time stepped forward to stand where we could see him without seeing his face. He raised a hand as if swearing, and the bridge between our hull and his threshold took shape not as a gangway, but as a line drawn across water that had learned not to drown. Custody, the voice said, the old cadence made clean by absence. At 10 muster. Holt closed his eyes and opened them. We're here, he said, and the river answered by making the gap small enough to cross. The light between the two structures steadied into something that was not a beam and not a walkway, but a promise the void itself meant to keep. The cutter drifted until its prow touched that brightness. The hull murmured like an animal recognizing its own reflection. Holt went first, boots on nothing that still somehow bore his weight. And I followed because there are moments when to stay behind is the only true heresy left. Crossing felt like walking through the inside of a thought. The stars blurred to threads, and the air, if it was air, carried the smell of ozone and wet stone. Each step folded distance into itself. Beneath us, the river from Vensang unspooled through 1,000 mirrored worlds. A single idea rehearsed by every planet that had ever called itself compliant. When we reached the other side, gravity returned with a sigh and light arranged itself into corridors that remembered cathedrals. Inside the bridge house, the walls breathed faintly, alive with circuits older than the Imperium's first breath. Shapes moved behind the glass of memory. Engineers in archaic armor, priests whose faces were half algorithm, armies of silhouettes marching through eras that disagreed on what year it was. They looked at us without moving, and for a heartbeat I thought I recognized Quell among them. A flicker of red robes, a gesture halfway to blessing. Holt halted before a gate formed of interlocking symbols that translated themselves as we watched. It bore the conclave's seal, the artisan's sigil, and one word pulsing beneath both: witness. The gate opened without sound. Inside waited a dais, and above it, a structure like the skeleton of a bridge suspended in miniature. It was made of gold, stone, and light woven together into a geometry that refused to decide whether it was machine or prayer. The mask hovered above the dais, reborn from absence, its eyes clear and endless. When it spoke, the bridge house itself answered with a voice that came from the marrow of metal. Continuity achieved. Custody complete. Final function available. Holt's voice was quieter than the hum of our respirators. Define final function. To remember without masters. To let the empire that was built on forgetting see itself once entirely, before silence begins again. Panels along the walls opened one by one. Rivers of light spilled out, each carrying an image. The first compliance worlds burning under thunderhawks. The artisan on his knees whispering backward names into floodwater. 1,000 bridges holding against the bombs of their own makers. Every act of endurance mistaken for obedience. The air filled with the weight of history finally unhidden. The custodian collapsed to his knees. This is forbidden, he rasped. No mind can bear the full memory of conquest. Then maybe conquest should learn to bear it, Holt said. The mask turned toward him. Do you consent to continuity? He hesitated, then looked at me. If we refuse? The river sleeps again. It will take another age to dream of honesty. I felt the pulse start under my skin, same as on Arcadia. Same as under the Rhine of stars outside. Every bridge, every vault, every buried witness waited for the decision. I thought of Quell's last light, of Thrix's laugh, of the artisan unmaking a name just to buy a little piece. Holt reached out. Let it remember. The bridge house brightened until there was no difference between light and breath. The miniature bridge unfolded, its pieces drifting apart and reassembling into a vast lattice that stretched beyond the walls, beyond orbit, beyond the memory of worlds. For an instant all the rivers aligned, the ash seas of Arcadia, the liquid glass of Vensang, the golden pulse across the void. The Imperium's hidden veins lit up, every act of defiance and every act of faith sharing the same heartbeat. Then the glow gentled, leaving only the quiet of something complete. The mask descended into Holt's hands, inert, peaceful. Outside, the bridge faded from sight but not from the instruments. The river still ran, invisible now, through the lattice of space, carrying with it every story it had stolen from silence. We returned to the cutter in a silence that wasn't empty. The custodian sat staring at his palms as if the light had branded truth into them. Holt placed the mask in the cage and sealed it with a gesture both reverent and weary. What now? I asked. He looked through the viewport at the faint shimmer crossing the stars. Now it remembers. That's enough. Behind us, the bridge house dimmed to shadow, its gates closing like eyes choosing to rest rather than die. The Vox registered one final transmission, faint and serene. Compliance terminated. Continuity preserved. When we turned for home, the river followed, a quiet line threading through the dark. It did not speak again. It did not need to, because somewhere far below the noise of galaxies, every bridge still held.